Ag PhD full episodes and more are now available on Acres TV, the newest ag platform connecting you to fields of information. Look for us on watchacrestv.com.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk a little about residue management. During our Farm Basics segment each week, we try to take something that we do on the farm and just talk about it in relatively simple terms. So even if you're not a farmer, you kind of know what we're doing out in the fields.
Well, and this is kind of the same issue that you're going to see in a lawn or in a garden as well. Residue management. When you have a crop, and let's just say it's a corn plant, and the corn plant gets 10 feet tall, and you take the ear of corn, in fact, you just take the kernels off the ear. So you've left the corn cob, you've left the leaves, you've left the stalk, everything else laying out in the field. Now what do you do with it? And oftentimes we get to the end of the season and we've had a great garden all year long. We've got the same thing. What do we do with all the crop residue? Or in the lawn, oh, you just cut the grass, but now you got all these grass clippings out there. Well, that's residue as well. How do you manage through the residue?
Okay, so first of all, residue is worth something. There are a lot of people that will take the residue, they'll bale it, they'll take their grass clippings, whatever, they take the residue off the field, and that's fine, you can do that. But you've got nutrients, number one, that leave the field then if you take the residue off. And number two, you've got some of the protection for the soil that also leaves the field. So if you want less residue on that field, you are simply going to have, or garden or whatever, you're going to have a little more erosion and you're going to have to put back a few more nutrients.
Yeah, the nutrients are really the big deal in my mind because we've got quite a bit in there, especially potassium. Now, that is going to flush out. It is going to come out of those stalks eventually, and it just depends on what you get for rain and weather and how many microbes there are in the soil and if there's soil contact with those stalks, all those kinds of things. So the nutrients are a big deal. They are going to lessen over time because they're going to start going back in the soil. But yeah, if you chop things and immediately take all that residue, you're taking quite a few nutrients.
Now, Darren used the word all that residue. Now, he was just saying take whatever residue off the field. But here's where I'm going with this. A lot of people think, oh, I've removed all the residue from the field. Well, don't forget that half the residue you can't see. Half the residue is below ground. We usually say that however big a plant is above ground, it's that big below ground. And that's where soil organic matter gets built from, is the roots when they decay. So sure, there are some worms and other bugs, animals that can pull residue from the soil surface down into the soil, and eventually that can become soil organic matter. But that's not the majority. The majority of soil organic matter build comes from plant roots, especially when you leave those intact and you do not do tillage. When they break down nice and slowly, they can become organic matter over time.
Now, what Brian said earlier too about residue, that it protects the soil. Think about raindrops and how hard they hit the soil, and oftentimes you see dirt splash up. If you've got a protective covering of residue out there, it protects that soil so it isn't going to get stirred up and washed off or blown away with the wind. That's a pretty good thing.
Yeah, it does trap some moisture there as well, but the downside is it's going to keep the soil cooler. So I guess I shouldn't say really downside. That can be good or bad. In my situation, in really cold soils, I don't like that so much, but if you have warm soils, keeping it a little cooler with all that residue is definitely a benefit.
So for farmers, they often will push the residue out of the way where they're going to plant the seed. So right on the planter, they'll have attachments on the front to just push the residue off to the side so the seed goes into nice dirt and doesn't have to push through all that residue to emerge.
One last thing that I want to mention, something that we've been doing on our farm for almost 10 years now, is we use what we call a chopping corn head. So we really chop that corn residue into very small pieces. That way it breaks down a lot faster. The point is we want to expose as much of the inside of that corn stalk and just bust up everything as much as possible. So then it makes the job easier for all the bacteria and all those microbes that are going to break that residue down over time.
Well, there's a lot to think about with crop residue, and that's wonderful, but one thing I don't want to find out in my field is our weed of the week. We'll show you how to stop this week's weed coming up later in the show.